Brian, there are two strands of thinking about the future. In a purely scientific sense, one can make an argument for determinism, that sequence of events occurs in the physical world that almost determine the future. Even in the quantum uncertainty, they all sort of average out, and so you can make that argument. And then many people, from a theological point of view, believe that either God foreordained the future or absolutely knows it. As you look at the relationship of God to the future, is the future settled? Is the future determined?
Not by God. If God had settled and determined the whole future, God would have determined that we do every evil that we do. We would not be responsible ultimately for it. God would. God would be the author of the Holocaust and everything else. And I don't believe that is compatible with God's being perfectly good. So I can't accept the claim that God is himself fully determined the future. If the future is in any way settled, it's only settled in the following sense. We will settle it when we get there.
Okay, let's walk through that one. That sounds a little complicated. So if we will settle it when we get there, that means it's open.
Right. The sense in which it's open, and that's to say it is in every way possible that we will freely choose to do one thing or freely choose to do its opposite. If the future is settled, then it is also the case that we will do one rather than the other. But that's because when we get there, we do it. In other words, the present fact that we will is a consequence of the fact that when we get there, we do.
But do they exist at the same time, or is there a sphere in which both are coterminous in some way? The fact that we will do something now I will do something, but in the future I am doing something. Are you saying those would exist in the same moment in some way?
No. What I'm saying is, my doing it then exists only then. It doesn't exist now.
Okay.
But if I do it then, that may have logical consequences for what was the case in the past. At an earlier time, it would have been true that I will do it.
Yes.
That would have been true because later I do it. Okay,
and if you didn't do it then now there would be a different way to describe it.
Right.
But from God's point of view, that would seem to make the future unknown.
I don't see why that would follow. We're supposing that there is a fact about what I will do. That's what follows if the future is in any way settled, by the future insofar as it contains my actions. If there is that present fact that I will do such and such, it's an open question whether God could know it. I don't see why he couldn't, or at least that would need to be argued out if you wanted to make a case that he couldn't.
What are the theological consequences of either side, either God knowing the future in a settled way or not knowing the future?
It's actually a relatively minor matter. It affects how we take what God says about the future. The whole reason we believe that God knows the future is because the Bible contains prophecies, claims about what the future will contain. It affects how we interpret those prophecies. If God sees the future, then when he issues a prophecy, he's reporting on what will be. And it was settled independent of him. If he doesn't see the future, if it's in all respects open, in no way settled, then when God issues a prophecy, it's more like he's making a promise. He's saying, this is what I will make sure happens.
Oh. And so in that case, God is determining for that event, that he has to cause it.
For that event. Well, he's not necessarily determining it. Think of it this way. Okay, Cyrus the Persian is marching toward Babylonia. God has predicted that Cyrus will conquer their empire and free the Jews. As long as Cyrus is going along on his own, God can just kind of let it happen. Okay, one day Cyrus gets homesick, and he's really starting to think, well, then God sort of works on his mind. He sort of reminds him of all the things he saw in Babylon on that vacation trip that he really wants to get to and own. So Cyrus keeps going. Next day he's a little more homesick. God works with his mind a little more. None of that is absolutely determining what Cyrus does. It's just inclining him a great deal in a given direction, and then he goes with the inclination. He's always got at least the possibility of continuing to be homesick.
But God is always going to fulfill the promise by whatever power God needs to exert to keep Cyrus on track, he's going to do.
And if in the extreme case there's just no blandishment God can use to get him to do it freely, God can take away his freedom. I mean, if God issues the prediction, Cyrus will conquer Babylon, then if there's no other way to bring that about, God will just force him. But
And we don't know where on that continuum God had to do. But you're using this as sort of an isolated event in God's providence working with the world. It's not doing that with everybody all times, making sure everybody does everything. He's picking his shots. He's saying, okay, that's important. I'm going to do that one. But everything else goes where it wills.
Well, when he issues a prophecy, he's making at the very least a commitment. This is one that will definitely happen. There's nothing else he's committed to absolutely forcing to happen. So he can allow things to progress sort of with a limited degree of freedom. I mean, there are some possibilities presumably God just won't allow. It may be hard to believe that given the things that he has allowed, but presumably there are some things so bad that he just wouldn't let things go that way. So he allows the world, in some respects, to run along freely, but it's like a river within banks. It can splash this way, it can splash that way, but it won't finally overflow.
And so what does that mean in terms of the future? What can we say, from God's perspective? Is the future settled or not? Or is it just settled in some isolated instances where God makes a specific promise or declaration?
I've spoken as if future events could make present facts about what will be so. But maybe that is not how things work. Maybe there are no present facts about what will be so. In that case, the future's open in a very strong sense. It's absolutely indeterminate.
And even God doesn't know.
Right.
If it's not to be known.
Exactly.
And that really doesn't affect your theology one way or another.
The only thing any religious believer is committed to, in virtue of accepting authoritative scriptures, is that prophecies in those scriptures are true. You can believe that the prophecies are true without believing that God literally foresees. I happen to think that God does literally foresee, but what I've been pointing out is that you're not necessarily committed to that, to believe that the prophecies are actually accurate.
But again, the prophecies are a specific, isolated event. They don't describe the nature of all reactions and all human beings' lives into the future.
Right.
So they're very isolated kinds of things. So what about for all the rest of humanity and life? How much of that is determined in the mind of God as it goes forward? It's just
apart from specific instances involving prophecy, I don't believe anything is forewilled by God. There's nothing God has decided will happen. Some of it may be foreseen, however. It's settled in his mind, but not because he's made it happen, simply because he's seen it happen.
Such as?
Well, if God is outside of time, as I believe, then he sees the whole of time, and every bit of the future is fully determinate in his mind. He sees what you'll be doing tomorrow, what you'll be doing the day after that. But that's not because he has in any sense settled that. You've settled that, he's simply recording it.
What are the implications for us as free moral agents? Either way, either the future is settled or not settled.
As long as it's not settled by virtue of God's having decided what it's going to be, our freedom and responsibility are not diminished. Just as my watching you speak doesn't take away your freedom and responsibility for saying what you do, God's watching you speak doesn't take away your freedom and responsibility either. So
in that sense, even if the future is settled, in defining this settled as God knowing it, we still are free moral agents.
As long as the way God knows it is like observing it.
as opposed to determining it,
Right.
enforcing it.
Right.
So foreknowing then is a kind of settling that does not diminish free will.
Right.
Whereas foreknowing by determining it or by forcing it would.
Yes.